All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into some really interesting data you sent over about how investors on Reddit are feeling right now.
Yeah, and so this data comes from AltIndex, and it gives us a pretty unique look at how everyday investors, not the big institutions, are thinking about the market.
So these are folks who are actively buying and selling stocks, not just the talking heads on TV.
Exactly, and as you know, they can actually move markets, particularly in this day and age.
And as you know, we've seen this in recent years, right?
Exactly, especially with these online communities.
So AltIndex is tracking these conversations on key investing subreddits,
Hmm.
and they've come up with some pretty striking findings about how this sentiment is shifting and what that could mean for all of us.
Absolutely, I think it's a really valuable perspective.
So let's jump right into the headline here.
Yeah, let's do it.
AltIndex says that investment sentiment on Reddit has plummeted to an all-time low.
Wow.
They have a scoring system that they use where point 1 is the most bearish, super negative, and 1 is the most bullish.
Like over the moon optimistic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And right now they're saying that sentiment sits at just 0.55.
Okay.
So definitely leaning towards caution.
Yeah, so that's a long way from where we were just a few months ago.
It's a huge drop.
I mean, Altinets points out that in December of 2023, their sentiment score was all the way up at 0.77.
I remember those days a little too well, I think.
Right. It's like everyone was feeling pretty good about things.
The market was doing, well, we had that strong S&P 500 return. I
Mm.
think it was like almost 25% for the year. And that was fantastic for a lot of people, but
Yeah, everyone enjoys a bull market, right?
for sure.
But what's striking is how quickly things seem to have shifted.
Yeah, that's the part that I find a little bit unnerving.
Like, when did this downturn really begin? Like, what's the time frame they highlight?
So AltIndex is pointing to February of this year, 2025, as the turning point.
Okay, so this year.
Yeah.
So very recent.
And they're linking that timing to a specific event.
Okay, I'm curious. Do they explicitly say what might have triggered this change in sentiment?
They do.
Okay.
They say that February coincided with increased news coverage of Donald Trump's proposed tariffs, and it seems like that's when this mood really started to sour.
I see. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
It does, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it from an investor's perspective, those tariffs have the potential to really disrupt things.
Hmm.
You know,
Sure.
we're talking potential trade wars, supply chain issues, all of which can directly impact company earnings.
So essentially adding a whole new layer of uncertainty to an already complex market.
Exactly. And for a lot of retail investors who maybe don't have the same resources as the big institutions, that uncertainty can be really unsettling.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, it's that fear of the unknown that can really get to you, right?
absolutely.
So it seems like these tariffs, or at least the talk of them, are playing a big role in this bearish turn we're seeing on Reddit.
Yeah, and when you see that kind of shift happening online, especially among a group that can really influence the market, it makes you wonder how unstable things might become.
Yeah, it's definitely a red flag.
So you've got to be careful.
But here's where things get even more interesting.
More interesting than an all-time low in sentiment.
Yeah, so despite this drop in optimism, engagement on these investing subreddits is actually increasing.
Oh, wow. So more people are participating in these conversations, even though the mood is getting more negative?
Exactly. It's like they're drawn to these forums to talk about their worries.
Wow.
And AltIndex actually gives us some hard numbers here.
Okay, what are they seeing specifically?
Well, the SAR stock subreddit has seen a 27% increase in subscribers just in the past year.
27% in a year. Okay, that's significant.
And then you've got Wall Street bets, which I don't even need to explain that one, I think,
Yeah, that one's gotten quite a reputation, hasn't it?
to say the least.
Okay, but for context for our listeners, what are we talking about in terms of growth there?
So they've seen a 19% jump in subscribers, which, may not sound as big as North stocks,
Uh-huh.
but considering their starting point, it's still a huge influx of new users.
Yeah, for sure. And as you mentioned before, we've seen how those communities can sometimes trigger pretty big price swings, even if it's not always intentional.
It's like a hive mind sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And when that hive mind starts feeling bearish, it's definitely something to pay attention to.
So we have more people than ever talking about the market on Reddit, but they're increasingly pessimistic.
That is a fascinating paradox.
It really is.
So why are more people engaging if they're feeling less optimistic?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, it's almost like a crowded room where everyone is whispering their anxieties instead of celebrating their gains, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a sign that people are looking for information, looking for reassurance in a time of uncertainty.
I think that's a really insightful point.
They're trying to make sense of these proposed policies. They're watching inflation figures like a hawk.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just generally trying to figure out where the economy is headed before they make any big investment decisions.
So essentially a collective quest for clarity
Exactly.
in a
Right.
time of, well, quite a bit of uncertainty.
Yeah. It's a very human response.
It is.
So let's talk about the potential implications of this dynamic.
Okay.
Low sentiment, high engagement.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for the market as a whole?
Well, historically, and AltIndex points this out as well, this kind of divergence has often been an early warning sign.
Of what exactly?
Well, it often suggests that there's growing anxiety among investors.
And we know what anxiety in the market can lead to.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it usually means more volatility.
Exactly. When people are uncertain and on edge, they tend to react more strongly to any news, good or bad,
Mm.
which can lead to some pretty wild price swings.
Yeah, it can make things feel very unpredictable.
So let's say this bearish sentiment continues to grip this large and growing group of Reddit traders.
Okay.
What kind of behavioral changes do you think we might see from them?
Well, I think we could see a few potential shifts.
Such as?
Well, firstly, investors might start to move towards a more defensive stance.
Meeting.
They might start shifting their money into sectors that are perceived as safer. Like utilities or consumer staples, things that people always need regardless of the economic climate.
That makes sense. A natural reaction to uncertainty.
Right, it's like battening down the hatches.
Exactly.
Then secondly, you might see a general decrease in risk-taking.
So fewer of those big bets that we sometimes see on places like Wall Street bets.
Yeah, exactly. People might be more hesitant to go all in on a particular stock or strategy.
More caution, more hesitation.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third potential shift that AltIndex mentions is a potential increase in short selling.
Ah, so betting that certain stocks are going to go down.
Exactly.
Oh.
It's a riskier move, but if you're really convinced that the market is headed south, it can be a way to potentially profit from that decline.
Yeah, short selling definitely has its own set of risks, but it's a strategy that some investors might turn to if this pessimism persists.
So overall, it sounds like we could be in for a pretty bumpy ride.
Potentially, yeah, but it's not all doom and gloom.
Oh, right. There's another side to this coin, isn't there? AltIndex outlines a scenario where things actually take a turn for the better.
Okay, so what would need to happen for that to play out?
What if some of these big macroeconomic concerns start to ease up?
Like what specifically?
Well, for example, maybe we get some more clarity on trade policy, or maybe we see some positive news on the inflation front. Something that gives investors a bit more confidence.
So in that scenario, what happens to this big pool of Reddit investors?
Well, they're already engaged in these conversations, right?
Yeah.
They're actively following the market. So if the sentiment shifts and suddenly things are looking brighter, they're in a prime position to jump back in with both feet.
Yeah, so potentially a pretty dramatic turnaround if those anxieties lift.
Exactly. And with the sheer number of retail investors out there now,
Right.
that could fuel a pretty significant market rebound.
Yeah, it's like this huge reservoir of potential buying power just waiting for the right signal.
It's a bit like a compressed spring,
Exactly.
just waiting to be released.
And that really underscores the point that AltIndex is making, that retail investors aren't just a sideshow anymore.
Yeah, they're a force to be reckoned with.
Their collective mood and their actions can have a huge impact on market dynamics.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to get caught up in, the news about the big institutions and the economic indicators that we sometimes forget about the power of the individual investor.
The collective wisdom of the crowd.
Like, exactly.
And this data really highlights that if you're ignoring that collective mood, especially when it's as low as it is right now, you're missing a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
So for our listeners who are intrigued by all of this
Yeah.
and want to dig a little deeper, AltIndex does offer some resources that you shared with us.
Oh, yeah, they have a couple of really cool features that they highlight in their materials.
Yeah, they mentioned their trending stocks on Reddit and Reddit stock alerts features.
Yeah, those sound pretty useful.
It's essentially real-time tracking of these conversations so you can see what's getting people excited, what's making them nervous.
And it gives you that insight into the hive mind, as we were saying.
And they also mentioned a personalized dashboard with deeper insights, AI stock picks, and a weekly newsletter.
So they're really leaning into this alternative data approach?
It sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So to wrap this up,
Oh,
what's the key takeaway from this deep dive into Reddit sentiment?
well, the main message is that investor sentiment on Reddit has hit a record low.
And what's driving that?
Primarily concerns about potential tariffs and just general economic uncertainty.
But at the same time, we have this paradox of
Yeah.
increasing engagement.
More and more people are joining the conversation, even as the mood is getting darker.
So what does that tell us?
Well, it could be a sign of increased volatility in the near future.
Because,
Well, all this anxiety could lead to some pretty sharp market swings.
but on the flip side,
Mm.
it also suggests that if those anxieties lift, if some of these uncertainties are resolved,
We could see a pretty powerful market rebound fueled by this huge pool of engaged retail investors.
yeah, it's like a coiled spring waiting to be unleashed.
So it's a fascinating dynamic,
It really is.
one that we should all be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Right.
What role do you think this collective sentiment, as reflected on Reddit and other online communities, plays in shaping market movements? And how might this information influence your own understanding of the economic climate and maybe even your own investment decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.